All right. Hello, everyone. It's good to see you. Thank you for joining in. So when we met 2 weeks ago, the richness of the chapter 8 on imaginary cities yielded such a sort of rich conversation that there was an interest in continuing the discussion of cities and urban environments and trying to connect, if there's interest, the ideas that are present in the book, especially the critique of the notion that cities are inherently hierarchical, that cities only form after kings. They challenged, the authors challenged that view. So there was interest in expanding or opening up the conversation to just talk about cities more generally. So I'm going to start with, I guess, something of a prompt or a thought, and it's the following. Among environmentalists, there is a core group of environmentalists who believe that urban society really is the direction that humans need to go in order to promote environmental sustainability, that urban environments offer efficiencies of scale that will allow for the implementation of more efficient, or the more efficient distribution of resources. As I read this chapter, I was thinking of that whole school of environmentalists, and it's not the only argument among environmentalists, nor does every environmentalist think that urban environments are the way to go. But there's definitely a camp out there that feels that way. And this chapter really made me think about what is it that constitutes a city, and are cities inherently the sorts of places where those kinds of efficiencies can be implemented. And so the first thing it did, this chapter, is it made me question just how we really think of a city. What is it about a city that makes it a city? Is it just sheer population numbers? Or are there other sorts of things going on? And then the other point that the chapter at least raised in my mind was how can cities, the cities that are shown in the text, relied upon and were often formed in opposition to the societies that surrounded them, especially in the case of heroic societies out in the hinterlands, and then commercial societies, bureaucratic commercial societies that predominated in urban environments. And their argument about the sort of dialectic between, or really the creative refusal between these two communities across huge spans of time, really made me think long and hard about the actual viability of cities as environmentalists understand cities. And so it made me think, maybe a problem is that environmentalists, in talking about the efficiencies of urban space, could very likely be relying on an essentialist understanding of what constitutes a city. And so it made me just really question everything I've ever assumed to be the case about this transition from countryside to city. Because if there's one line or trajectory that most people automatically assume when they compare the so-called ancient world to the so-called modern world is that level of urban complexity. And typically the assumption is made that once people develop cities, that there's no going back. And what is so amazing about this chapter and the next is that, in fact, there's always a way to go back, and that there really aren't any of these essentialist notions to cities. And that, as David Graeber repeatedly said, we could just as easily remake society in a different way. And so I mean, honestly, I never really expected there to be the level of sophistication in the egalitarian towns that they do discover. And so that alone for me really disrupts conventional narratives that assume, like diffusionist theory, that there's this inherent movement toward greater urbanization, and that therefore means greater hierarchy and social complexity. And so they in my view, do a really good job of going back to those first principles and disrupting them in such a way that those kinds of assumptions, I'm hoping, among specialists they might be the case, but I'm hoping that this kind of idea will branch out into just ordinary society, because the conventional wisdom is today in 2020 that we're better than people were in, say, 1020. I'm not sure, because I don't think there's any inherent linear trajectory to social evolution, which is, precisely the point the authors are trying to make. So I welcome your thoughts on cities, environment, or anything else that might interest you. I know that some of you express an interest in sharing some insights from your towns themselves. One of the things that the authors are trying to do in telling this history is showing that once cities get established, it doesn't mean that they need to be established or fixed in that same way forever. And for so many of us, the idea of undoing a city is sort of like a historical impossibility. And yet they're trying to show that not only is it possible, but these things actually happened in the past. And so there's no reason why they can't still happen. So yeah, I throw it open to anyone who wants to chime in.
Yeah, Nika.
Nika? Oh, you're on mute. Oh, still you. We can't hear you, Nika.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry. So first of all, I have a question. I grew up in industrial society in Soviet Union, and it was always contradiction between cities and farmers. They even until 1964 in Soviet Union, farmers didn't have a passport, so they were assigned to these kolkhozes, so they were not allowed to move out. And it was a bunch of literature describing a different lifestyle, and it was a lot of privileges for people in the big cities, as I grew up in Leningrad, that was 5 million citizens. But now my understanding, my current understanding is that we don't need this separation when we're talking about cities and farmers. It's all very artificial and also commercially driven. So we very well can produce our food and everything and energy in the city. And actually, I probably would agree with this urbanist that Stephen mentioned in the beginning. To my understanding, I may be wrong, so that's a question. It's much more, it's better for the environment to live in big cities, and it's much more costly to live in a small outskirt, because you have to rely on nature and you have to exploit the nature in this way. So how I would envision the city that I would feel safe and sustainable is actually a lot of people in the same place, arranged in a kind of technological way to with the green energy and urban agriculture and so on and so forth. And what I see now going on is people are moving into city in big numbers. So recently I read that amount of population the size of London every month in the earth is moving from villages to the cities, but mostly it's refugees or it's people who deprive of land that was bought by the big corporations and so on. So, and they have a miserable life in the cities. Meanwhile, the rich people in the cities are buying villas outside of the city just to have a clean air and so on, so they can drive their Teslas to the city when they want to have a party. So there's a two moves going on. And with my neighbor and friend architect, he just draw this little calculation. He took all population on Earth, and it's actually not only him who did it, it's many people did this calculation. So all population on Earth can move in the UK if the density of population will be the same as Manhattan. And then we can leave the rest of the Earth to animals and, to preservation and so on and so forth. And it's also very well proven that Manhattan can be sustainable if they grow food on the roofs, if they do use green energy. So it looks to me, if I will plan the future city, I will plan it exactly as, Manhattan in England. And that's it. And then leave the rest of the earth to the earth, to the birds and so on.
May I?
Yeah, Simone.
Good evening. So I'm not sure. I remember a movie by Otar Yosseliani. I was looking for the English title of this movie. In Italian, it was Un incendio visto da lontano, which means a fire seen by far. And it was about the life in an African village and how it was slowly destroyed by the arrival of capitalism, and it ended with a fire of the forest and with people selling their idols and their stuff at the market of a big city. So the displacement of people in big towns by now is a result of the destruction of the environment and is a result of land grabbing and of it's the same things that make species to extinguish are those that push people into towns. There's not so much of a choice in it. So, and as for urban societies, oh, thank you, Lorenzo. As for urban societies as born because of schismogenesis, this is one of the possibilities. Another is connections that were already in place, collapsing in just one place, but maybe while maintaining their the movement, the roads, the connection, the bigger connections they had. And when we talk of cities, my model is Italian commons. You know that when they made the La Commune de Paris, the name and the model came from Italian commons that were just what happens when the empire collapses, or better said, is in place just by name. Here in Bologna, we have a palace that is the palace of King Enzo. Enzo was the son of the emperor, and he was captured by the in war during a war of the Italian commons against the emperor. And this war was the final stage of independence that had grown up during the Middle Age, despite the fact that theoretically there was a central authority. This central authority was just like that of the mock kings that David's described in the book. So I know that this book is about anthropology and archaeology, but at times I'm quite astonished of the lack of reference to more to history, to the commons that deployed the very same kinds of complexity and self-regulation that they witness in ancient towns, ancient cities, and also by their ignoring I already talked about it, the laws of hospitality that are so important in Mediterranean culture for sure, but also I think all over the world. So I would have liked if they relied a bit more on archaeological traces in present day traditions, because in a way tradition never dies, and there are I think the hospitality law of my grandmother is an archaeological trace of ancient times, of the times when people traveled and was sure to find hospitality because they were sure of the connections they had very far from home. So I put many things together, but that's all, guys.
You know, I like that point, Simona, about the commons and the destruction of the commons over time, and this demographic shift from the countryside to the city, because people are being forced out of the countryside and land is being increasingly commodified, that we're witnessing the destruction of the commons. And hospitality that you mentioned, I like the way that you frame that it's like a piece of the archaeological past that is the kind of social characteristic that has made the third freedom, the freedom to know that you can leave and walk away and find some other place to exist. Yeah, that is increasingly dissolving because the commons are being destroyed as people are moving into the cities, because those opportunities for them out in the countryside are diminishing. And so there's kind of this ironic movement that it's an injustice that's forcing people into the city, and yet, as Nika mentioned, the cities do offer these efficiencies. And so I get the feeling that what the authors are trying to suggest is that cities are always going to be with us. The distinction is who gets to imagine that city and how do they get to imagine it. And that's where the differences appear. Yeah, it's a lot of food for thought. Ido, am I pronouncing your name right? Ido?
At this point, I forgot, honestly. It derives from Hebrew, but I've just been surrounded with English speakers and German speakers for the past few years. So I've heard some nice variants. Italians are actually quite good at it, if I'm being sincere. I find the idea of how cities are unmade, and well, through unmaking them, they are made again, quite appealing, because this is something that I've experienced growing up in Jerusalem and living right now in Berlin. And it appears that for both these cities, in very different manners and histories, if we are talking about histories, the ways in which they were unmade were actually through a series of calamities and catastrophes. It was through such physical unmaking, the tearing of the actual fabric of those urban terrains, that they were able to be molded yet again in different shapes. And it appears that many times those shapes were made not only by the predominant ideologies that reigned throughout that process of unmaking, but rather, as you said, through the imagination and the reinterpretation of those specific cities, which I think is quite an astonishing ideological project if we consider it as such, because for most cities, for most terrains, as we think about them, of course they exist in a physical space, but they also exist in some sort of collective unconsciousness simultaneously. And it is those two processes that make and unmake both of those spaces simultaneously. I think that a pretty obvious example, if I'd have to think of my hometown, is that the necessity to represent the city to its community is the one that defines it in different terms. It's almost as if the city is a series of misconceptions over time as to the idea of what that place actually is and what it could offer. So any time that there is an archaeological finding in Jerusalem, of course, it has to be defined by the ideological constitutions of those that want to claim ownership over the city in one way or another. So you have like this really weird anachronistic mishmash many times in so many spaces. in which the way in which the holy is represented is only through, well, commercial means, for example, which is just like, it's an unbelievable calamity and oxymoron. But I think that we could define it also in secular spaces, of course. I mean, we could see it any time in which we could see it in museums, we could see it in folk tales. But of course, I mean, it's a super interesting topic. So that's what I had to say.
Thank you for those thoughts. Would anyone like to add on? Rob?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I just like to have the input that architecture and city probably is a marketplace, and architecture is something we are able to build, like the early moving people who built their tents from what is around. But I just wanted to put in that we nowadays have all options to build houses and cities we never had before in history, let's say. There is a technology, there is a knowledge what is necessary to try to keep our planet alive, and we know what is necessary to do. But now the question is, what do we like to have? This is all for the moment, I'd like to say. And there is a lot of course, we can go into the past, and each building is replacing our culture, our mind, our way we made our life. And so now it's a new question, a totally new question than we ever had before. That is what I feel like. And for example, Nika, to build a city of England is possible. If you include the oaks there and include the beautiful landscape, everything is possible. You must not erase what is actually there, but we have to build, like the question was before, our imaginary city now. So this is, I think, and I love the power, for example, enormous of the big cities. You have a lot of energy, and you feel bored. You go from Greece to an island and you think you cannot stay there of boringness. Nobody would go there except of holiday, and you immediately want to return. But this is everything possible now. That is my input I would like to give, from materials and from knowledge and from to understand what we need for the future and what we don't need, what we don't like. Probably we don't like cars, we don't like roads, I don't know.
So it's interesting. So you've got the beginnings of the city, which is dishonest. It's about the appropriation of land for use by a certain group of individuals for various different nefarious needs. But then you have the modern prospect of imagining something that's more honest than that and is more deliberative and all of those things. But how, you know, so the city, that's a very different city to the city we have in the past, or our idea of what a city is. Because, you know, at the moment, I came to London because I love London. So my interaction with London is positive, but most of people's interaction with London is not actually positive, it's negative. So you know, how do we envisage a city that is a positive thing rather than a negative thing? And you know, a big part of that is the fact that the whole system's pretty fucked. But actually we're at a point where things are beginning to change, and it's sort of that honesty part of what a city could become is quite interesting. And that idea of how you could then use everything that isn't the city is quite honest and interesting, because it starts to talk to current problems. And rather than think about ideologies, thinking about problems without an ideology is quite good. But whether you can even begin to think about a problem without an ideology is another problem in itself.
Yeah, but its ideology is also probably a big part of that, because all London, as Leningrad, as Moscow, as New York, they all built around production and consumption. So you have this downtown where people work in, and then you have like areas where people reproducing their life. So if it's possible to imagine a city that built around reproduction of life, that's maybe would be good for us to envision. And I just want to say that the stories in this chapter is about that. And it's actually, I really loved how architecturally the city described. For example, it's a city with no center, doesn't have a, like, you know, the big figure of heroes or the church in the middle or things like that. So all city is constructed through this equal household. And also I love the sculptures that they found there that they can't identify. It's like there's some female characters. So if anybody wants to talk about, yeah, I would, for example, I would really love to hear other people talking about the practicalities of the cities that they found interesting. Like, for example, Kellick, we were talking about pirates. And pirates build their cities, and they're like very different from the imperial cities that they were fighting with. So maybe she wants to talk about that.
But Nick was asking for the floor.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Is my microphone working? Okay, thanks. For me, when I think about the city, I think first that we have a really big moral debt to pay, because I imagine the city being a symbolic, where you have the ground floor, and you have a skyline of a Western wealthy city, where a lot of power and hierarchy is in the center, where you also see the bigger buildings. And everybody in this group together can brainstorm and come up with a list of what city centers impose, what kind of institutions are there, what kind of services, and everything centers around the city, about the power being very formalized and measurable and knowable. We all have a social security number. We know, the government knows how much money we make a year. We have data on how much money the city makes every year. We know what areas need more investment, etc. And then the city has a pool. It's like with this song from Alicia Keys, like, if I can make it in New York, I can make it everywhere. So a lot of people can latch on to that. And if you fall down, if you get into poverty, or you lose your house, you lose your network, or you have mental health issues or whatever, then you fall on the bottom. But it's still like, even the bottom is calculated and has roads that have a number and a name, and you can still get like sucked up into the city. But if you look down on the city, literally there's only like ground, there's sewer and ground stuff, but morally there's an informal economy where there's our fellow human beings who don't have social security numbers, and because they are not recognized by the law as being formal citizens, they don't have the rights. And there's no city where these people, these human beings, are actually above the bottom line. So I think our cities of today cast a really big shadow over hundreds of millions of people who are living in an informal society and economy. And I think that's our first challenge to bring necessary change.
Kelly?
Did you speak?
There was someone with their hand up before Kelly, I think, while, or is that?
It was Kenneth, I think. And we talked together yesterday because we are lucky to live in the same city in Toronto. And yes, and we discussed that yesterday. So I think he wanted to say something about that.
Perhaps you can go ahead. I could talk later.
I mean, I don't have, I don't have something specific to say about pirate cities because I haven't studied that aspect of pirates. But I think, I mean, I was wondering, and it's true, we had a very interesting discussion 2 weeks ago, and I was happy to see that this was continuing this week to discuss more specifically what we are living and what ideas we have for the cities of today. Because it's true that the title of this chapter is Imaginary Cities. And but what we can see in the chapter is that at the end, what is presented as the end of the city's expansion is actually the imagination of those who developed heroic cities, meaning it was really a stop put through imagination when we started also to put an end also to the interest in written contributions, and where we put heroes to replace the structure that we had before, which was very egalitarian. So I think maybe that's also a call from the authors to say, go back to your imagination to regain what we lost at that moment. So I very much welcome that second one, and that's what we had discussed yesterday with Kenneth also regarding the city of Toronto, which I don't know very well because I just moved there, and this is why we started to discuss that yesterday, and we are ready also to do some more concrete things in the coming weeks to work on that together.
I think Steven connection is unstable, so maybe somebody wants to take over moderation. Simona, do you want to do that?
Well, Kenneth, are you adding something?
Thank you, Kelly. That was actually the top of my mind still. I flipped back to the start of the chapter. Cities begin in the mind. And I really like that idea. And I think it gets to the heart of, shall we say, the poverty of imagination today as to what cities are. I think one of the key things we are confronted with right now is our diet of imagery and possibilities, so to speak, for what cities could be is very, very poor. It's junk food, you know. It's a lot of how people imagine cities is now captured by people like Elon Musk, and their dreams of what cities could be are incredibly boring. It's such an impoverished imagination. So I think I want to pose the question to everyone here, and I have some answers for myself as well. How might we feed our imaginations? What might constitute a richer diet of inspiration for what cities could be. Drawing from my own experiences, I've for the past few years, a lot of my inspiration has actually come from fiction. To give a few titles, Invisible Cities of Italo Calvino, of course, was one of them. Another one is a book by Ursula Le Guin, Always Coming Home. And she's imagining, a far future post-apocalyptic world. And it sort of echoes some of the points in this chapter around the vast cities, around the geometry of the circle. If that was the fundamental understanding for mathematics, what will our worldview be? In her case, it was the spiral as opposed to the grid, which underpins a lot of violences, as Nika had pointed out earlier. For Toronto, what I've found very good in terms of spurring imaginations has been Indigenous knowledges around what settlement and what a city, so to speak, could be, in communion with other kin species, for instance. But also immigrant communities here. There's this often repeated statistic that the most cultivated crop in North America is actually lawn grass. One thing I've noticed, however, is that especially among Vietnamese communities in Toronto, there really is it just comes naturally to transform the front lawn into a garden, into a vegetable garden. The book seems to argue that one possible source of inspiration is actually archaeology and anthropology. But I wonder if perhaps if we were to open up that as a question, what would constitute a rich imagination diet for cities and how to belong together? Thank you.
Isabel, you had...
What a great question. Yeah, please, Ben.
Oh, hi, sorry. I hope I'm not interrupting anyone, but yeah, I actually was going to make a very similar point to what Kenneth said, which was about going back to sci-fi, actually, and exactly the example that David Graeber put in the book, which is about Omelas. And so I think one of the key answers is perhaps in terms of expanding the imaginary is also just bringing in people from so many different fields and backgrounds. It isn't just about anthropology or archaeologists, also bringing in artists, writers, really expanding that kind of creativity in that way. And it doesn't necessarily have to be about reinventing the wheel. It can just be getting inspiration from these previous sources and from all kinds of different sources in that regard. That's just the point that I wanted to make.
So, there's also, interestingly, that fear of failure element of our society is really important, and that societies are sort of now moving towards this position where failure is considered to be an absolute, it's tantamount to a sin, effectively. And that doesn't allow people to imagine very freely. And so, take away that fear of failure. And suddenly, and this is partially what came out back in the Second World War, the ideas of welfare states and things like that. Take away that fear of failure and you emancipate more people. So it's sort of going back to go forward, looking to different cultures for inspiration. All of those things are really important. It's like a big mixing pot of stuff.
I also want to ask, oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. So it's Michal?
Yeah, okay.
Just one quick comment on sort of agriculture and the way people are being displaced. The only way that you can displace agriculture is you have a fossil fuel agricultural economy, and then you use fossil fuels to grow plants, and then agriculture with fossil fuels isn't actually very effective in terms of the amount you grow on the soil, right? But in order to do that, you'd have to have human labor, and that human labor is made expensive. And a capital can make a lot of money using fossil fuels, so they do that and displace people. Just the other point is about what I thought a number of people have mentioned this, the idea of a city with the center that is empty. There's that image in the chapter about this book, about the thing. Some of the other cities that are described, the center is a big common area, but it doesn't have any of like sort of bigger houses or big space where people can meet, but the center is sort of empty. And this, or the example of the Basque community where the city is a circle and is put together. And one of the things, and so I think that is very interesting. One of the things that you see today in cities is the fact that land is made into property. So elsewhere in the book, David Graeber talks about the Latin word usufructus. So the rights to land, you have different rights to land. Someone can use the land, someone can take the fruit off the land, children can play in the trees, but no one can chop the tree down. It's common land with various rights, but no one per se owns it, although some people may have different rights than other people to use land, like children can do different things than say grown-ups can in a playground. And I think that's a kind of key thing, whereas now we have single, like the land is owned by someone, and therefore you can't really, that commons is destroyed. So in a slum, the land isn't really owned in some ways. People all come in and move in, and there's a different type of architecture. Instead of big grand buildings with, like, it's all people backed in, and it becomes a very dynamic environment. Now, sometimes slums have problems because they don't have enough resources, but that's an issue of not of the architecture, which is a fascinating architecture, a density and an interest. People all come in and build something, just in the way a circle might, of a Basque community, people will build a house, and there's certain rules that you can build a house and how you interact in the community. A slum is like that. So I'll point to the different, a particular architect, Paulo Soleri, who was theorized about how to build dense architecture where people all live together. And one of the villages that he built was Arco Santi. And you compare that to the city of Phoenix, which is the least environmentally sustainable city in the world. The temperature is way hot. It doesn't even exist unless there's air conditioning, because it's just not livable. And so there's one other book on the city today and how people imagine it and how it's developed is, and I'll put this in the chat, I took.
Michael, you muted. It was so interesting.
Sorry, I hit the wrong button. Yeah, so I just put this in the chat. Is the it's a little bit about Arcasante and that. But another book that is really interesting is by Debbie Shaw in London. She's an anarchist and writes on stuff. And she wrote the book Post-Human Urbanism, arguing that the city today, even there's a humanist view, by which she doesn't mean like people, you know, the kind of original tradition of humanism against the Christian or the other religions, which means humanism, opposing the humanism of, say, the French Enlightenment, where there was a certain type of human that were better, the white man human, and the other people that were the colonized people were inhuman, subhuman, right? So that, opposing that type of colonial humanism, she's arguing that there's an imagination of the city that is a post-human urbanism versus, and does the sort of history of people imagining how people imagine cities, and so that's another useful book. I'll put that in the chat.
Simona?
Yeah. Yeah.
Simona?
I'm muted. Okay. Yes, I three different things to note. When talking of imaginary cities, they refer to my beloved Elias Canetti, and to the fact that very large social units are always, in a sense, imaginary, and they refer to our ability to connect at a very local kinship level and at an imaginary level with virtually, like we are doing now. We feel connected even if we are not in the same room, and so it made me think that, as a matter of fact, we are always imagining other people, even when we are face to face and talking to each other. We are always doing this interpreting labor that is to getting the effect that the other person has on us, and interpreting it and reacting. A conversation is always also a matter of imagination, and this is the same thing that we do when we imagine collectivities on a large scale, in a way. And this brings me to festivals and carnivals. One of the points of the chapter is about corvée, that were an essential point of the city's self-organization, and it had a religious aspect, but even this religious aspect was something of the kind of civic religion, civil religion. I mean, it was about serving the gods, serving the city, serving the community. It was about being a part of the community. And this takes me to carnivals. I don't like Venice Carnival, which is commercial. It's resurging the past. It's a masquerade, very strict now that it is so commercial. I had friends in Venice, and our carnival was different. But I have friends in Viareggio, which is a very communist libertarian town, and I saw how they prepare for carnival, and this is really a community exercise. There are groups belonging to neighborhoods. The town is divided in neighborhoods. Each one of them prepares a chariot for the carnival, and this is the most important thing they do all over the year. And winning the parade of chariots is the most important thing that can happen to you. And the identity of the town being you belong to Viareggio if you belong to a neighborhood that works on a chariot. And this also made me think about the fact that carnival is not just about subverting the authority. It's not just about turning the power upside down. It is about reinventing ourselves. And this is the third freedom. It's about the masquerade is theater. And it's not by chance that what resurged in the Middle Age, despite the church being very against it, was theater, masquerading, inventing another life for themselves, for ourselves. When you make theater, when you put on a mask, you are acting, you are another person, and you are reinventing yourself without together with others. And no, just so. I think this is also one of the archaeological pieces that we have in our traditions, and that are quite interesting, and that resurge as soon as they can, as soon as there is not a power that destroys them, and even despite this power, the only thing that is really able to destroy this creativity, this collective ability to reinvent ourselves is the commodification of like it happened in Venice.
I think it's Ido now.
My Wi-Fi is terrible, but I think that the point that you made is a fascinating one, namely that, well, if we are to think of the nature of Carnival as something that is always in motion and reinvents itself, it needs to revolutionize its well, where it is set and how it is set in order to stay effective. And I think that in large ways, it has always been a way of, well, almost a form of shortcut in which, well, people could assume power for what it is, which is sort of a status of make-believe. I don't know if anyone has seen the movie Paris is Burning. It actually, I found it to be very similar. It's how mostly queer and LGBT Black and Hispanic people in New York City actually had a form of mirroring those in power to those positions that they could never really aspire to, whether it be lawyers or doctors, really solely based on the fact that they couldn't introduce themselves to those well, to those hierarchies, and the only way in which they could do so is actually by pretense, by performance, by dance, and by that actually create, well, not only an imitation of those forms of power, but see it also as an exuberant source of creativity and entertainment. The one thing that I wanted to say most importantly was in relation to Kenneth's point, and also the point that we made about city centers. I was in London last year, where I've done my master's at the LSE, and it was unbelievable to see that the city center, for the most part, was a barren land. I mean, if we are to think of the spaces in which the city center has been deprived as a source of, again, creativity, or really as a place in which people would want to spend time with, it was actually in the margins, places, neighborhoods where I've lived and where I've spent time, that those what made the city basically pulse were still existent, and it really by the fact that they were unregulated and not, well, scrutinized at the same, I don't know, to the same status of cultural and economic pressure as the city center. well, really spaces in which were not defined by their movement and the exchangeability as the city center, but rather spaces in which those forms of kinship that we've talked about constantly shape and reform and are the basis for those spaces. Something that the city center in most cities no longer consists of. And I think that the final point that I would like to make is a point regarding the imagination and how to rekindle the imagination. And I suppose that that was maybe the biggest cultural shock that I've had moving to London from Berlin. It appeared that, well, due to the really just the economic structure of the city of London, all the ways in which people would like to define, well, the possibilities to, well, nourish their imagination have been increasingly difficult. If we're talking about any sort of idiosyncratic rituals, such as long walks in the park, or even the possibility of spontaneous interaction, have been standardized for the most part when by the sheer fact that people don't have well, spaces that would cater to such activities. And even if we're thinking of creative labor today, or even if we're thinking about what creativity means today in the city, or what imagination is in the city today, or in modern settings in general, it seems that on the one hand, imagination is still thought about as this vast mental scape of, well, in which people could define their own, well, their own selves to themselves. But the only way in which it could be expressed, or the only way in which it is seen as worthwhile, is only if imagination in some way could be turned into something that would be commodified, into something that could be monetized. And I think that that is the tragedy of imagination today. The fact that we have this vast mental scape, and it is only defined its worth in only this singular form.
Just answer that.
Yeah.
So, well, you've got your hand up anyway. So,
Yeah.
but well, also that sort of speaks about pointless choice, which is basically what you're talking about: the commodification of things that aren't even choices. Oh, I can choose Pepsi Cola above Coca-Cola. You know, which T-shirt do I wear? All of that sort of shit are the choices that people are given on a daily basis, but they're denied the choices that they actually want. And that's where closing down cities is quite interesting. That if you begin to close down a city and force people into a situation where they begin to think about the choices they might have, then that's quite interesting. It's something Occupy did, something Extinction Rebellion have done. It's sort of all of those things are thought experiments in the way you begin to rethink cities, by forcing them to actually begin thinking, because the choices we're offered in our current systems are not choices. They're just basically the you know, routinely similar things. It's which deodorant do you want?
Yeah.
Do I fucking care? You know, it's those sort of things.
Yeah, and then most of these people who call creative class, they all creative because they have to package these choices that is pointless, and they have to, like, you know, get money for the most successful packaging. But I also want to say that about Carnival, that if I think about my ideal city, it will be a city in the center of which will be only empty, and once a year it will be a carnival, because this is like an alive sculpture created by people who have a space to reinvent their own social structure every year, let's say. And also, as Simona was saying, I think it's in this chapter as well, that most of the people who lived in the big cities, they don't actually know a lot of citizens. They only know somebody who they live in with, you know, and their family. So that's, in any case, the structure of the city that, you know, already exists by default. And the last things I want to say is about what Michael was mentioning about refugee cities. That is, because they're mostly illegal or they kind of temporary, they don't have this defined structure with the center, with commodification, and then they actually have the normal human things that was going on when the people are changing and interacting and so on. And as harsh, it's very kind of sad to say that, because I don't want to live in a refugee camp. I hope I would never live in a refugee camp. I'm sure this is not a nice thing to praise this framework, but it looks like this is our hope, because this is the people who is getting to the roots of what city could be. And the other thing is, I just look at the numbers before this reading group. I forgot the name of the book, but it's in many articles. It's these numbers are quite clear. We are almost already living in the most developing cities is the cities of refugees, and this kind of illegal settlement that is happening outside of the big megapolises. And as Kit Hart was coined this term for informal economy, this is actually an economy. It's much bigger than this formal economy that's calculated. The same thing's probably going on in the city development. This informal settlement or refugees camp and so on. Yeah, that's the future of humanity in a way. So if I would think about what city I can imagine, I would probably think about how to preserve the good things about refugee city, but improve it in a way that it will be livable and it will take away all the horrifying things that is going on now. Because I was visiting like this informal settlement in South Africa, and it's a disaster. It's really sad. It looks horrible. Or like in Lagos, there's like huge amount of people living with no electricity, no drinking water, and so on. So that's just kind of the reality.
Be interesting, the polit cult thing that you've talked about a lot. It'd be interesting, you could probably talk to that a bit, because that idea of giving things away and not, and communalism rather than communism, and all of those sort of things are really important. I think the way that you can have all those positive transactions that we have that are totally free are totally undervalued, and how do you raise those to the surface of a society so that people can begin to understand and value them more? Because we're constantly pushing all the really important shit down to the bottom and valuing the really unimportant shit at the top. And it's sort of, I think the polit-cult thing, most people, has anyone heard of polit-cult in this group here?
Polit-cult.
Polit-cult.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we were talking about that, yeah.
No, I mean, because I'd never heard of it. Nika talks about it as if it's common knowledge, basically.
Yeah.
But we'll talk about it a bit.
Polit-cult is, I think we talk about that. It's also in this article. Yeah, we had one of first reading group in Museum of Care was about this article that we wrote with David, and it's was about polit-cult. It's basically, it's about how to structure imagination collectively, and about different system value. You can say that about polit-cult. Proletarskaya kultura, proletarian culture. Yeah, it's forgotten Russian, but maybe that's for another things. Maybe we should give Steve to wrap up, because we should watch out the time.
Let's see if my internet is working. Everyone's really choppy and the audio is going in and out. So I hope you're able to hear me. Thank you for coming, everyone. This has been wonderful. I see on my screen my internet connection is unstable. So again, I don't know how much of this you're hearing. We will convene again on February 3rd at the same time with the same link. And we will tackle the next chapter, Hiding in Plain Sight, which is on the origins of indigenous democracy. And the authors use the examples of Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico and the Inca Empire to talk about forms of egalitarianism and how these forms can be rejected or can in some cases become the sort of base.
I think live internet connections just, Steve, yeah, just faded. Yeah, okay, so thank you everybody for coming and see you next time. Was it
On the 3rd of February.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Ciao a tutti.
Ciao a
Bye.
tutti.
Thank you. Bye.